The wrong prisoner incident. In 1942, in Nazi-occupied Latvia, SS officer Hoffmann was looking for prisoners to torture. When the Germans captured Riga in the summer of 1941, the city was home to roughly 40,000 Jews, and within months, most were unalived. The 4,000 survivors were all sent to a forced labor camp which Hoffmann ruthlessly ruled over. He was an officer who took genuine delight in beating defenseless prisoners, and out of all the people in that ghetto, he had a favorite target. There was one young prisoner who was noticeably fitter and stronger than anybody else, and something about that offended Hoffmann personally. He singled the young Jew out again and again for special treatment, and one day, Hoffmann got him exactly where he wanted him. He found him alone in a room with no witnesses, no other guards, and absolutely nothing stopping the officer from doing whatever he pleased to the prisoner. By every rule of the camp, the young man's life was over. But Hoffmann had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The Jew he wanted to unalive wasn't any ordinary prisoner. He had cornered a champion boxer. Before the war, Nathan Chapeau was a renowned athlete and Jewish boxing champion in Riga. He had quit school at 14 to support his family, and he'd never stopped fighting. So while Hoffmann saw a helpless prisoner standing in front of him, what was actually standing in front of him was a competitive fighter in his athletic prime with years of accumulated rage and absolutely nothing to lose. When Hoffmann moved to end him, Chapeau's training simply took over. A left hook, a straight right, then one vicious uppercut. The SS officer tumbled down, and Chapeau finished the job with a stool over his head. Chapeau kept this all a secret to avoid being punished, and he miraculously lived in the labor camp until it was finally liberated by the US Army. An armed officer of the SS lost a fistfight to the prisoner he had spent months beating for fun. The ballerina incident. On October 23, 1943, a monster at Auschwitz was having fun. SS Oberscharführer Josef Schillinger had just received a fresh transport of Jewish prisoners. Schillinger was a roll call officer with a reputation for cruelty so extreme that witnesses described him as the monster of Auschwitz. The 1,700 people arriving that day had been tricked in one of the most evil deceptions of the entire war. They were wealthy Polish Jews who had paid for foreign passports at a place called the Hotel Polski, believing they were being exchanged and sent to South America. Instead, the train stopped at Auschwitz, and they were told they were simply needing to be disinfected before continuing their journey. The poor prisoners were led to an undressing room which was actually a gas chamber. Schillinger walked among them, and his attention locked on to one strikingly beautiful woman who was refusing to fully undress. He was an armed SS officer towering over an unarmed, half-dressed prisoner, but unknown to Schillinger, he had just picked the worst target in the entire camp. The woman he was threatening wasn't any ordinary prisoner. You see, Francesca Mann was one of the best dancers in all of Europe. In 1939, at an international dance competition in Brussels, she had placed 4th out of 125 of the best dancers in the world, and she was widely considered the most promising ballerina of her entire generation. A professional dancer of that level possesses explosive speed, total body control, and reflexes most soldiers could only ever dream about. Francesca had spent the entire war trying to survive, and she now had nothing left to lose. When the officer went to do terrible things to her, she exploded. In one swift motion, she threw a piece of her clothing into Schillinger's face, and in the split second he was blinded, she snatched the pistol from his holster and fired 2 rounds directly into his stomach. She then turned the weapon on a second SS man, Wilhelm Emmerich, and put a round in him too. The other women in that room, standing at the door of a gas chamber with nothing left to lose, attacked the SS men with their bare hands. The camp erupted into chaos, and the camp commandant himself had to rush in with reinforcements, carrying machine guns to put the revolt down. Schillinger perished from his wounds that same day, and Emmerich walked with a permanent limp for the rest of his life. But unfortunately, none of the women survived the day. In a place engineered to make human beings feel powerless, a ballerina disarmed the SS with a piece of clothing and made sure her final performance was the one they'd never forget. The fitting room incident. On October 14, 1943, SS Deputy Commandant Johann Niemann was walking across the Sobibor death camp. He was heading to the tailor shop because the prisoners had a beautiful new leather coat ready for him to try on. Sobibor camp existed for exactly one purpose: Roughly 250,000 innocent Jews were ended there, and Niemann was the highest-ranking officer in the camp. He was responsible for ruling the prisoners who were kept alive only as temporary labor. It was an ordinary day when Niemann strolled into the tailor shop, put the coat on, and waited while the prisoners fussed over the fit. But there was one small problem with his appointment. The prisoners weren't actually interested in the coat. 3 weeks earlier, a transport had arrived at Sobibor carrying Soviet prisoners of war, and among them was a Soviet soldier named Alexander Pechersky. The camp's underground leader had been searching desperately for someone with military experience, and now the universe had given him an actual officer who had survived typhus, brutal prison camps, and tank battles. Within 3 weeks, they had built one of the most audacious plans of the entire war. The prisoners secretly forged knives and sharpened axes at the camp's own workshops. Then, on the chosen afternoon, they would exploit the one weakness every SS officer at that camp shared: greed. The officers had been stealing the belongings of the people they murdered for years, so the prisoners simply offered them beautiful things. A new coat here, fine boots there, one at a time, by appointment. Niemann was standing in the tailor shop with his arms out, admiring his new coat, when a hatchet crashed into his body. The tailors hid the body, cleaned the floor, and got ready for their next appointment. The commander of the camp's guard force, Siegfried Gretschus, walked into the shoemaker's shop for his fitting, and never walked out. One by one, appointment by appointment, the deadliest men in Sobibor strolled into those workshops, and in under an hour, 11 SS officers had been quietly erased by the very people they were planning to erase. Then, a guard discovered a body and the whole thing exploded. Pechersky shouted for a full breakout, and roughly 300 prisoners stormed the fences, tearing through barbed wire and sprinting across a live minefield toward the tree line. 50 of the escapees survived the war, including Pechersky, who spent the rest of his life telling the world what happened there. That said, technically, I guess those Nazis were all fitted for something. The Sentry Incident. In 1944, in German-occupied France, an SS monster was patrolling streets. He was part of a force of 22,000 German soldiers sent into the region to crush the French resistance once and for all. And these men did not fight clean. They burned villages, tortured prisoners, and executed civilians for fun. So when the sentry spotted a figure creeping through the darkness, he was probably already imagining the reward he'd get for catching a saboteur. Then, he got a better look and realized it was a woman. For an SS trooper, this was about to be the easiest victim of his entire career. All he had to do was raise the alarm, and she was finished. But there was just one slight problem with that plan. The woman he had cornered wasn't any ordinary resistance fighter. He had just stumbled onto the White Mouse, the most wanted person in Germany. The White Mouse was Nancy Wake, a journalist from New Zealand who had personally witnessed Nazi mobs terrorizing Jewish civilians. She made herself a promise that day to fight against the Germans until her last breath. When France fell, she began smuggling Allied soldiers and refugees over the Pyrenees Mountains into Spain, saving hundreds of lives while the Gestapo tapped her phones and read her mail. They wanted her so badly that they had put a 5 million franc bounty on her head, and they called her the White Mouse because every single time they cornered her, she vanished. When France finally became too dangerous, she escaped over the mountains herself, reached Britain, and joined the Special Operations Executive, whose instructors taught her explosives, weapons, and silent hand-to-hand combat. She parachuted right back into France to arm and lead 7,000 resistance fighters. The German soldier had just caught a fully trained Special Operations Commando in the middle of a raid, and he was standing between her and her target. Before he could open his mouth to raise the alarm, she struck him once in the throat and crushed his windpipe. That was the entire fight. He was unalived in seconds. The easiest target of his life had just become his last one. The bus stop incident. Most Nazis learned these lessons during the war, but there was one who did things worse than everything you've seen so far, and it took an extra 2 decades to catch him. In 1960, In a shabby suburb of Buenos Aires, Argentina, a balding, middle-aged factory worker named Ricardo was walking down the street. He lived in a small brick house with no electricity and no running water. He was, by all appearances, the single most boring man in South America. While most people around him didn't know it, this man was responsible for more human suffering than every other villain in this video combined. Ricardo Clement didn't exist. His real name was Adolf Eichmann, and he was the chief logistics architect of the war. He was in charge of the designing, organizing, and leading of Germany's plans to unalive the Jews. He personally set up the train schedules and the routes that carried millions of Jews to camps like Auschwitz. When Germany collapsed, Eichmann slipped through Allied hands under a fake name, hid for years, and eventually escaped to Argentina, where his wife and sons later joined him. And for a decade, it worked. The most wanted architect of the Holocaust simply vanished into a quiet, gray little life. And every year that passed made it more likely that he would die a free man. But he had made the worst mistake of his life in targeting these people. The Jews would make it their mission to track him down and get their revenge for the atrocities he committed. All they needed was a little clue, and Eichmann's own son gave it to them. Klaus Eichmann began dating a local girl named Sylvia Hermann, and he bragged to her family about his father's importance to the Third Reich. What Klaus failed to notice was that Sylvia's father, Lothar Hermann, was a half-Jewish survivor of the camps who had been beaten by the Gestapo so badly that he had gone blind. The Hermanns quietly connected the dots, and the tip eventually worked its way to Israel's intelligence agency, the Mossad. Israel had a decision to make. Eichmann was living in a country that had a habit of not extraditing Nazis, so a courtroom request wasn't going to cut it. Instead, they assembled a team of special agents, many of whom had lost their entire families in the Holocaust, and sent them across the world to bring him back in person. For weeks, they watched the boring factory worker of Garibaldi Street, learning his schedule down to the minute, especially the moment every evening when he walked the short, dark stretch to his front door. The man assigned to physically grab him was Peter Malkin, a Mossad operative and hand-to-hand combat expert, whose sister and her children had been ended in the camps. On the night of May 11th, 1960, the team parked a car on Garibaldi Street with the hood up, pretending to fix a breakdown. Eichmann's usual bus came and went, but he wasn't on it. The agents sat in the dark, sweating, debating whether the whole operation had been blown, until at 8:05 p.m., another bus hissed to a stop, and Eichmann walked out. As he walked past, the Mossad agent turned and said 3 polite words. "Un momentito, senor?" As Eichmann froze, Malkin lunged, and the two of them tumbled into a ditch, with the German screaming into the night. Within 20 seconds, the architect of death was gagged, bound, and lying on the floor of the car under a blanket. The man who had sent millions to their ends without ever dirtying his own hands went completely silent and still. At the safe house, the team checked his old scars and confirmed it, and eventually Eichmann himself admitted exactly who he was. 9 days later, he was sedated, dressed in an airline uniform, and walked straight past Argentinian police onto a flight to Israel, masqueraded as a groggy crew member, and he was gone. When Israel's prime minister announced to the world that Adolf Eichmann was in Israeli custody, the announcement landed like an earthquake. He was quickly convicted, sentenced, and executed. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered at sea beyond territorial waters, so that there would never be a grave, never a memorial, and never a place for anyone to honor him. The man who tried to erase an entire people from this earth ended up with no country, no name worth keeping, and not a speck of dirt to honor that name.